water. Just getting that going for getting that started. So, yeah, thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you so much, everyone who's been helping, organize and get everything together, corralling all the speakers for StaffPlus. This is very exciting for me. I attended my first StaffPlus last year and was invited to speak this year. And during that time, my son was born, and I've had some time to work on this, so let's see how it goes. But yeah, as Tanya said, my name is Hehr. You can find me in most places online as @hipsterbrown. You might also see this avatar as well. I think it fits pretty well. I don't know about you all. And I joined VM last year as a senior developer advocate, where I help people learn to build robots and automate the physical world. Before that, I was a staff engineer at Betterment, and in my limited free time now, I enjoy climbing indoors and being able to cycle on long bike rides outdoors. And then after that, I also like to tinker on my home and control hardware with JavaScript. If any of that interests you, come find me. We can chat about it, nerd out about it later. And last, but certainly not least, I love open source. My perspective on collaborative software development has always been colored and skewed by the way I learned to build software in the first place. I didn't go to school for it. It was learning online and in the open and with people who are willing to share that knowledge with me. Having worked on a variety of open source software and open source hardware projects, I will just refer to them collectively as open source projects. And I'm not a purist about the term either. So I recognize that some of the projects that I reference may not fit the strict definition of open source software. And I would not be where I am today on the stage, in my job, in many of the jobs I've had, without the open source communities and the amazing people that made them the supportive environments in which I was able to grow and learn. I know that's not the same for everybody who's contributed to open source or have experienced that, but that's just where I'm coming from. And so I want to thank those folks from the Hoodie, Tessel, Johnny 5, Node Serial Port projects for all they've done. And some of those projects may no longer be active, but they're certainly not forgotten. It wasn't until I was promoted to the role of staff engineer at Betterment that I recognized a lot of the attributes and skills that I practiced were instinctively modeled after the mentors and friends from the open source projects that I worked on previously. This talk is my attempt to organize the key elements from participating, contributing, maintaining open source projects that are sought after skills for StaffPlus individuals, as well as how to put them into practice inside of your teams or organizations. I've observed, 3 tenets of StaffPlus principles that have been seen in practice by open source maintainers. It is my hope that you'll come away from this presentation with new approaches about how you operate as StaffPlus leaders and maybe be a bit inspired to contribute to your favorite open source project. This is probably a familiar phrase to a lot of you who have seen maybe your company career matrix or heard from their manager when discussing what they're looking for in a StaffPlus role. Compared to the management track, senior individual contributors, or ICs, are sought after for their technical influence over the directions of a project or whole organization, without holding authority over individual team members, the ability to promote, reprimand, or fire. If you've ever participated in an open source project, this tenet should be pretty relatable. Most of them are made up of volunteers who are motivated but don't report to any other individual. Both StaffPlus roles and open source maintainers require strong communication skills to convince and motivate the team or entire organizations or entire ecosystems to follow the ideas that they believe should be implemented. These can be quick decisions, like choosing a library or for a feature or not. Long-term bets, like selecting a language or a framework as the standard for a product as a whole. So how do you go about accomplishing this sort of task? Well, it's tough to execute on a plan without a shared understanding of why and how you made it. How well can you, as a technical leader, explain your thinking or even the collective idea of a group that's come up with these ideas together to other team members who may have infrequent familiarity with the project, again, as a whole? This is like trying to cook a meal with a room full of other chefs, and maybe some chefs leaving and going in the kitchen at all times by going off a menu that's just up here, just in your mind. Some of them might get it by just watching what you're doing for a little bit, but others might just go start making a whole completely different meal. And it's certainly a lot quicker and more efficient if you've ever even had a brief discussion beforehand. And being able to point to artifacts for this communication, plans and decisions like requests for comments, RFCs, architecture decision records, design docs of any sort, go a long way towards this goal. When questions come up around why certain standards are in place, or what led to using one technology over another, these documents can be great asynchronous references for new team members or contributors. These decisions can evolve and change over time due to new circumstances or requirements for a project, which is why it's also helpful to document why you may not have chosen a certain path that was explored. For example, if your team is choosing a front-end framework, which ones did you explore and why was that final selection made? The larger the initiative and the wider the scope, the more communication is required to get everyone moving in the same direction. The Internet Engineering Task Force has one of the longest public records of RFCs to establish the standard of a medium that connects us all. Programming language groups like Rust, Swift, Python are great references as well for documenting the various concerns of a very wide-reaching set of projects. As I've explored the Python ecosystem in more recent months for work, it's incredible to see the libraries and tools that point to PEPs as a reference to the spec in which they're conforming, even as they're moving the ecosystem forward. Gov.uk has always been one of my favorite examples of how an organization can work out in the open. They document their design decisions in RFCs and have a robust design system to cover the needs of their platform as well. A lot of great accessibility knowledge in there, by the way. It doesn't have to be super formal up front either. It's more about the motion of opening up a topic for discussion with folks who are impacted or have additional knowledge about the impact of the changes to provide feedback on the shape of that design. We just heard about that from Eva, talking about talking to the people using it does have a nice impact on how you shape that design going forward. With the Hoodie project, we just started out with a general discussion repo. This is before official discussions existed on GitHub. And this just allowed us to coordinate shared topics across the many repos of the project. And while I've seen them adopted more in private organizations, there's a good number of examples of architecture decision records in the open source ecosystem as well. The Home Assistant project, which has been around for nearly 11 years and one of the most active projects on GitHub, has an enormous task of providing an open platform for smart home devices and integrations. They have 5 years of ADRs that cover things from minimum Python versions that they support to code formatting to how they plan to deprecate legacy features without breaking their ecosystem. At Betterment, they adopted ADRs both internally and in open source projects maintained by the company. These were used alongside RFCs and design documents within the organization, depending on the initiative and the audience that they're speaking to. Another company that has openly committed to ADRs is GitHub. And they demonstrate it very well through projects like their GitHub Actions Runner and the Primer design system. You can tell I really like design systems, having worked on a front-end platform team before. And here are a number of other helpful resources about learning about adopting open communication and in this historical format within your team or organization as a whole. ADRs are actually a really great way to get started because they're typically a historical reference. So consider what parts of your domain that are stuck as word-of-mouth knowledge and would be helpful for anyone trying to onboard onto your team or when planning to make a change to that decision later. You don't have to be in a StaffPlus position to start writing an RFC or a design doc or an ADR. But in those roles, you have the best context and to provide influence over these artifacts. However you plan to communicate your decisions, whether internally or in the open, let's not forget the reason why we're doing it in the first place. Through all the jargon and diagrams, be sure to address the audience, which could be future you, a new team member, or a complete stranger on the internet who has taken an interest in your project. Now, yet another common idiom of the StaffPlus vocabulary. Has anyone ever heard of scaling yourself? Raise of hands. Okay, great. It is a reminder about the inefficiencies of attempting to do every task by yourself, solo, while applying the same level of quality and care to the project. Many times you might be tasked with leading a project or initiative that is deemed important, but there's no official or dedicated team behind it. About a year after I joined Betterment, I made the case for a front-end platform team to support the growing usage of front-end frameworks, component libraries, and associated infrastructure to ship them across various applications. Much to my delight, the team was approved with a headcount of 1, me. This basically shifted what I was doing alongside my day-to-day work on a product engineering team to making it my full-time job. Now I had to figure out how to maintain all these projects I was responsible for while proving it was worthwhile to keep investing in this team. So I put on my open source maintainer thinking cap to consider how I observed this being done by others. First off was investigating where people were losing the most time in getting stuck in any of these projects. This would help provide a set of priorities, as it was key to get some quick wins before making any larger long-term bets. And this was mostly done by looking through PR comments, questions asked in Slack to find common issues, or people just coming to me directly. It might not be surprising that one of the things I discovered that one of the core areas of friction was me. Hi. More specifically, it was the manual processes that relied on a maintainer or another person with authorization to complete. For example, if someone contributed a new component or change to our internal design system, they had to wait for someone to run an existing release script, which was nice, but in their local development environment, which was authorized to do so, to publish a new version to the appropriate places. I did my best to keep the waiting time as minimal as possible, but I can only be on top of so many different things at once, and this put a lot of pressure on me when I wasn't available. So putting time into automating this process freed up more of it for me to focus on working with teams and individuals more personally. This was something I learned from Gregor Martinez on the Hoodie project. He's now a staff engineer at GitHub and a lifelong friend. What are some of the other tasks you can think of that rely solely on you or an unreasonably small group of individuals that could be automated completely and reliably, or distributed more widely? An example of distributing this type of work came from ideas like Suze Hinton, no-op cat, who created AVR Girl Test Pilot as a way to help with the friction of manual testing. If you've ever worked with hardware, there are so many different devices that could be impractical for an individual maintainer to test all of them, especially in the world of Arduino. This was a tool that was a CLI command away, making it as smooth as possible for people in the community to share test reports and be recognized for the contribution. The Tesla project integrated a custom crash reporter to automate the creating of issues with stack traces. It stripped identifying information like usernames and home paths, while informing users how to follow up with the created issue. This kind of tooling embedded in the projects can help with the task of identifying common issues, finding those patterns, and putting data behind your planning without compromising on the privacy of the people that use it. Automation is fun, in my opinion, but scaling yourself is more than just offloading those tasks. It's about enabling the next generation of maintainers and StaffPlus leaders. New maintainers don't just pop up out of the ground, ready to lead a project. Some can grow in the harshest of climates, but many can thrive in a nurtured and supported with guidance and mentorship. This is often overlooked by maintainers who want to keep their heads down and focus on the deep technical problems. But it is exactly that deep technical knowledge that makes them the best person to distribute the work to multiple others who want to get involved with the project. This is something I appreciate about the Hoodie project as I experienced it from end to end. I started out contributing tutorials and API documentation. Finding good first issues, I started contributing code. Over time, as my understanding of the project grew, I started helping plan features. Eventually, I was offered a role as maintainer. Can you think of those gateway tickets that for a new person joining your team, or a senior engineer looking to make a bigger impact? More than just creating issues or tickets, does the content of the task include enough context to allow anyone to pick them up without your intervention? This can be a real test of how much you understand a problem when you need to essentially draw a map to the solution without digging up the treasure for yourself. It can be hard to let go of being the person to implement those big features, maybe seeing your name on the major release. But I appreciate what Jan Lennart said to me on this topic. How can we hope to grow and improve if we don't get out of our own way to let fresh eyes and ideas explore with the open support? Home Assistant has an interesting approach to scale out the task of code review, which can take up quite a bit of time for individual maintainers, and hopefully get a handle on the growing backlog of PRs. First, let's appreciate the lovely checklist of items that set the bar of what's expected by a pull request for this project. And finally, it prompts potential contributors to review 2 other open PRs as an incentive to boost the chance of yours getting reviewed. They even provide a handy link to a filtered view of open PRs that have passed CI and are waiting for review, meaning they're not in a draft mode anymore. Would you feel confident doing this? Either opening up for more people in your company to provide code review to maybe things they're not super familiar with? Could that really put the test of how well you're opening up your PRs or other people are opening PRs to describe it to someone who may not, again, have the complete context of what's going on? Ultimately, scaling yourself comes down to how well are you setting up your team for success when you're not there. As much as someone like to be indispensable, people get sick. They take vacation, they go on parental leave, and they move on from the company. Projects without succession plans may be doomed to wither and fall apart. Which brings me to my final tenet. This whole time, I've been referring to maintainers without maybe providing a sort of shared definition about the role. I quite like the list of roles provided by a recent Linux Foundation survey. In particular, the maintainer role. A maintainer is a key individual or group of individuals responsible for the overall management and well-being of the open source project. They make critical decisions, they merge contributions in the project, release new versions, and ensure the project's long-term viability. Does that match your image and understanding of maintainers in your mind? If you've heard of Tanya before, it might be from her fantastic book or from her blog post about being glue, which is the concept of glue work that keeps a project together and a team successful, unrelated from code usually. Reflecting on the definition that we just read, did anyone see pushing code in there? If you've ever watched any live streams of people maintaining open source projects, it might be just me, you might be familiar with what's involved. They are typically responsibilities for these tasks because they have the most knowledge about how it all runs and tend to toil away in the background to make sure it gets done. Without this work, the project starts to topple over under the weight. When I see this XKCD comic now, I don't think of that little block as the open source project itself, but rather the maintainer as a tiny atlas holding up this world that we depend upon. And now this is where I get on my soapbox a little bit. Maintainers, both internally and externally, are the glue for applications, services, and infrastructure that you use to hopefully be successful as a company. Does anyone here know who maintains each of the dependencies that you rely upon? I don't. And this is not meant to be a scare tactic, but rather it's a story of people trying to keep one of those tiny blocks in the stack balanced and accepting help in that endeavor. And unfortunately, bad things can happen. Stories like this shouldn't have to keep coming up to build awareness if technical leaders inside of companies can help keep those concerns top of mind. As you can continue to explore and create with open source, be mindful of the people behind it, but even more importantly, pay the people behind it. I'm slightly biased having worked at Open Collective in the past, but there are many options for learning about the project you depend upon for seeking support. As StaffPlus leaders, you can influence this initiative to keep the stack funded and running smoothly. When funding is not available or possible, consider how to give back through contributing your time and your knowledge. This can go a long way to distribute the burden on maintainers. Now to review. Communicate like a random person on the internet might stumble upon it, or hopefully people within your company who want to help you out. Find opportunity to be human and set a path for others to grow so that you can also grow alike. Recognize yourself as a maintainer and remember the shoulders of the other maintainers that we stand on. You have an advantage as leaders inside your company because hopefully you're all moving in the same direction together. And hopefully you're all motivated to accomplish the same goal. But that's not always the case, and hopefully you've learned something from this talk here. And I hope you take it with you out in the open as you learn and grow. Thank you very much.